You're listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Puja Mehra.
Professor Abhijit Das, thank you so much for coming to the show to discuss the India-UK FTA and Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement that has just been signed yesterday. I can't wait to hear from you what you think of it. I have seen a lot of very positive commentary and first remarks, responses from a host of people. There seems to be a lot of excitement about it. So do please tell us, what do you think?
First and foremost, Pooja, thank you for having me on your podcast. Now, rightly so, there has been a lot of excitement about the India-UK Free Trade Agreement, or CETA as it is called. This has been long awaited. If we take our minds back to 2022, there was some sentiment that we would have a deal by Diwali, and the two sides appeared to be literally hurtling towards a deal. And I would say that luckily that didn't happen. And that enabled both sides to reassess their positions and come up with an agreement that would be on firmer footing after a lot of reflection. So that's one important point which we should bear in mind. The positives, what we've heard and what little I have managed to read in the text, positives are quite a few. First and foremost, with tariffs coming down on some of the products of our export interests in the UK market, such as textiles, apparel, leather products, footwear, gems and jewelry, some agriculture products as well. These are set to see good export prospects. Whether our industry is able to take advantage of these export prospects is a second matter. But the government has provided the industry, the business with the export opportunities. Same goes for services. There are multiple channels through which the UK will facilitate India's exports of services, in particular of service professionals. Then we also have something on geographical indications, products whose quality characteristics and reputation are closely linked with the place of production. Darjeeling tea is a good example. Ulhapuri chappals, much in the news these days, is another good illustration of a geographical indication. So what the FTA promises is some sort of a speedy mechanism for mutual recognition of GIs of the two sides. So these are issues which would certainly be exciting for industry and businesses on both sides.
Professor Das, just to take up the tariff reduction, I believe, to zero for labor intensive Indian exports, such as in textiles, apparel, footwear, etc., which is the main source of excitement, I feel, because it feeds into India's ability to resolve the jobs problem, the need to create jobs that we've been trying to tackle for some time now. Is the UK market large enough? And does this reduction of tariffs make Indian exports competitive vis-a-vis other countries, other exporters to the UK?
Puja, UK market is certainly large, but it is not growing at a fast pace. So yes, the opportunities, the potential which might exist, there may be restrictions. But having said that, what is important to bear in mind is that our exporters were competing with some of the other countries who were getting access into the UK market at very low tariffs. So there is likely to be a diversion of trade from these competitors in favor of Indian exporters. And that is where, even if the UK market is not expanding at a fast pace, because of this diversion of trade in favor of Indian exporters, that is where the opportunities will really arise.
That sounds exciting. Are there any issues that are also of concern, or largely everything is positive?
On manufacturing exports, I did not see anything in the agreement which makes a mention of UK's carbon border adjustment measure. The implication is that once UK starts imposing the CBAM, this has the potential to erode the price competitiveness of Indian exports, particularly in sectors which are energy intensive, and that will diminish some of the export prospects. Turning to agriculture sector, there the problem really will arise from the stringent sanitary and phytosanitary standards which are applied by UK. If our exporters are not able to comply with these standards, then the opportunity will remain just a potential. It will not get realized to a large measure. So that is an area where the government might play a facilitative role or trying to strengthen the ability of our agriculture exporters to comply with the SPS requirements in the UK market. So that would be an area of concern, and also how it could be addressed. Then there are areas of concern in, let us say, government procurement or intellectual property rights, as well as some of the hardcore non-trade areas such as labor, environment, gender, etc. We could discuss those subsequently.
Before we get to them, should we talk a little about trade and services?
Yes, certainly. In trade and services, UK has committed to ease the mobility for professionals. And when I say professionals, this includes different categories such as contractual service suppliers, business visitors, intra corporate transferees. This is definitely an important commitment on part of UK. Then we have a provision of 1,800 additional visas for select service providers. Of course, the number is not very big, but it will be for service providers, yoga instructors, chefs, etc. Then there is a commitment to conclude an agreement around the social security contribution, what is technically called the double contribution convention, whereby if an Indian service provider pays social security in India and he delivers works in the UK for up to 3 years, then he will not be required to make this social service contribution in UK as well. At this juncture, there's a commitment to conclude an agreement on this issue, but hopefully the agreement will be concluded in parallel, in tandem with the implementation of the free trade agreement. Then there's also a promise to initiate negotiations for mutual recognition of qualifications, professional qualifications in the two countries. Here, the lead will have to be taken by the recognized professional bodies in the two sides. Governments may not have that big a role to play. But yes, that still will be a facilitative process, and the governments on the two sides could endeavor to hasten the possibility of the professional bodies in different sectors, such as accountancy, nursing, dental, medical, to come to some sort of mutual recognition of each other's qualifications. So, these are some of the areas where we could see substantial gains in services in the UK market. And let's also remind ourselves that at this juncture, services exports from India to UK outstrip our goods exports. So these commitments on the UK side should be lauded.
Right. And I think the agreement says that there's going to be substantial increase in annual trade by the year 2040. Does that figure seem plausible? And does that figure, besides seeming plausible, seem something to be celebrated? Is it ambitious?
Let me put it this way, Puja. There is a study which came out on the website of the UK government sometime around 6th or 7th of May. That study sought to quantify the likely increase in bilateral trade on account of the FTA. And the study is very carefully worded. What the study says is that because of the FTA by 2040, the bilateral trade will increase by 25 billion pounds per year. Now, that doesn't mean the increase in bilateral trade will be 25 billion pound in 2026, another 25 billion pound in 2027. No. What that means is bilateral trade will increase each year, no doubt. And the cumulative increase will amount to 25 billion pounds by 2040. Now, if we convert those numbers into annual increases, for India, it translates into an increase in exports of about $1 billion each year, which may not be a very significant amount. So while we should be celebrating the some of the provisions of the FTA, we have to bear in mind that the actual increase in our exports of goods and services taken together may not be a very astounding figure. If we go by the UK government study, it may be a modest increase of about 10 billion pounds overall by 2040.
And we don't have an Indian estimate for this.
I haven't come across an Indian estimate, and nor has the government put out an Indian estimate.
Your own view is that we'll do more than this, the increase would be more than this, given it is such a huge tariff reduction which allows Indian exporters a certain competitive advantage over other economies.
Puja, from the UK perspective, rather from the perspective of our exporters in the UK market, the UK was already imposing fairly low tariffs. So, to that extent, tariffs will certainly come down to zero in a large number of products, but it'll come down to zero from a very low level. So that will not result in huge export increases. And that gets reflected in the study by the UK government. 10 billion pounds increase for India, 15 billion pounds increase for UK. And coming back to your question, whether the actual performance may be more, that will depend on many dynamics. Actual performance could be less as well if UK decides to start imposing the carbon border tax. If our agri exporters are not in a position to comply with stringent sanitary phytosanitary requirements, the actual exports might be more than what is projected. If we are able to attract investment in some of the key sectors, if our exporters in textile and clothing sector are able to scale up and take advantage of the export opportunities. So I would be hesitant to commit either way. I have given you the two possibilities. If ABC happens, then the export potential may not be realized. But if DEF happens, then maybe we might be able to do much better than these projections. So sorry, I'm not able to give you a pinpointed black and white answer to your very important question, Pooja.
No, I understand, because so much is depends on how exporters respond to these conditions that they will be subject to be able to access the UK market. But was it at all possible for India to make sure that these conditions would not apply, or India would also eventually like Indian exporters and Indian business to comply with some of these conditions, such as on environment, etc.?
Let's look at the carbon border tax. It is supposed to be in favor of protecting the environment. And if we go by a study undertaken by UNCTAD, then European Union's CBAM will have a glorious impact of reducing global carbon emissions by a figure of 0.1%. So clearly, these measures are not aimed at having very strong environmental results. These measures are more or less a disguised restriction on trade. These are green protectionist measures. And I'm sure Indian negotiators would have taken up this issue with their UK counterparts. Very fact that there is nothing in the agreement on this suggests that there was no meeting of minds, there was no convergence on this very, very important issue, which can threaten to undermine the export opportunities from our side.
Right, right, right. And could there have been a possibility for transfer of technology, for green products, etc.? Is that something we could have tried for?
Puja, in some of these sectors, rather in one of the chapters which is related to environment, there was a possibility of at least injecting the idea of technology transfer for green products. Unfortunately, it does not figure in the final agreement. So we have missed an opportunity. We should have attempted to have some language, some text, even if it's not, even if it were not to be legally binding, not legally enforceable, but at least a beginning could have been made whereby there could have been some soft commitment from the UK side on facilitating transfer of technology for environmental products. That would have given a signal that UK is really serious when it comes to addressing environmental challenges. But there we seem to have missed this opportunity.
In fact, I tried reading the agreement and there are 30 chapters, and some of the chapters I didn't read them, but titles relate to corruption, IPR, competition, subsidies, state owned enterprises. I know it's called a comprehensive agreement, but what is the link with the opening up of? We are being told that nearly 100% of trade has been freed up. So, is there a link? Why do we need to have these chapters? I couldn't understand.
Puja, nor could I, and that is why I call these modern generation FTAs as far from trade agreements, because they have issues which have nothing or almost nothing to do with trade. What is happening is that the developed countries are using trade negotiations and trade platforms for rule making or for enforcing obligations in many different areas, obligations taken, for example, at ILO on labor standards, or obligations taken in multilateral environment agreements on environmental issues. Those are now sought to be, their implementation is sought to be monitored through trade agreements, which I don't think is a good trend from the perspective of developing countries.
And when you say that, these will be monitored, like for instance, the chapter on subsidies, will they monitor subsidies India has in place for our exporters or, for instance, the production link incentives, etc.? Does this agreement have any impact on any of these subsidies?
The provision on subsidy will really require India to make periodic notifications in respect of what are called specific subsidies. And India would be required to, in a way, demonstrate how these specific subsidies do not have an adverse impact on trade of UK. We will also have to ensure that these subsidies are used for the specific purpose for which they were granted. So these are some new obligations which go beyond the corresponding obligations at the WTO on the subsidies agreement. And that really raises a very important question in my mind. Agreement has to be mutually beneficial, right? I was not able to identify in chapters such as those on subsidies or labor or environment where I could have said, well, this particular provision is in favor of India. I couldn't identify those. So I presume that these are based more on the template of the developed country FTAs. And we may not have succeeded in pushing issues of our interest in these chapters. That is my apprehension.
I'd like you to explain this a bit more. Just taking the example of subsidies, for instance, if UK has concerns about some subsidy, say a production linked subsidy to a sector that they also have an export interest in, will they be able to penalize India in some way or Indian exporter in some way?
No, they will not be able to penalize us. There will be a need to notify the subsidies. There will be consultations where presumably India will have to hear out the UK side and see how best it can address the concerns of UK. Now, UK could have done the same thing at the WTO, but the WTO processes are more time consuming. And in the FTA, these processes are likely to be expedited and there'll be additional obligations on India. For example, what I said, that we will have to ensure that the subsidies are used only for the specific purpose for which they are granted. And then the burden of proof will be on us to show that these were granted and do not have an adverse effect on trade. I do see some difficulties in implementation of these chapters. Although, let me hasten to add that these chapters, including chapter on subsidies, will not be subject to dispute settlement. But having said that, these will be, their implementation will be monitored through committees. And if we are found to be repeatedly flouting the rules contained in these chapters, then UK will be well within its rights to say that India did not negotiate in good faith or India is not implementing the agreement in good faith.
And what does that result lead to?
Reputational damage?
Right. And Professor Das, now that we have this agreement with the UK, how does this affect our other ongoing trade negotiations? Will other countries also demand similar provisions?
Bang on dot, Puja. The concessions that we have given to the UK, be it in terms of the sectors where we've chosen to eliminate tariffs or provisions on government procurement, European Union, US, they will definitely pitch their demands using what we have given to UK as the baseline. And as we have seen in the case of government procurement, each subsequent FTA builds on and creates new obligations, expands the liberalization, makes the demands, makes India's commitments more expansive, more onerous. So, what you have said is a very, very likely scenario to unfold in the coming few months.
Right. And what about the chapter on IPR? What does that seek to do?
Puja, the IPR chapter is quite extensive, covering a large number of intellectual property rights as well as enforcement. I have not yet had the opportunity of going through the IPR chapter with tooth comb, but what I found a bit worrisome is in the context of patents and access to medicine. Let me step back a minute and mention that under WTO's TRIPS agreement, there is an exception whereby governments can grant a compulsory license in case of a national emergency or other circumstances of extreme urgency or in cases of public non-commercial use. Now, this is commonly called the compulsory license provision. This is an effective tool to make sure, let us say, in the pharmaceutical sector, that the patent holders do not charge very high, exorbitantly high prices. Governments can actually mandate compulsory licensing and, in a way, ensure domestic availability through their domestic producers. Of course, the patent holder would need to get some reasonable compensation. So, this is one route. Second route is what is called voluntary licensing. The patent holder grants a voluntary license to a manufacturer in India or a seller in India to sell the patented product. Now, world over, compulsory license has been recognized a very, very important policy flexibility policy tool available under the TRIPS agreement to facilitate access to affordable medicine. Now, the India UK CETA has gone against this grain. While there is a recognition that the IPR chapter will not limit either India or UK's rights and obligations under the TRIPS agreement for compulsory license. But on the other hand, the agreement also recognizes, or the agreement specifies, that both countries have recognized that the preferable and optimal route to promote and ensure access to medicines is through voluntary mechanisms such as voluntary licensing. This, to my mind, effectively puts on the back burner the possibility of India resorting to compulsory licensing anytime soon. I do think this is a provision which is likely to see a lot of debate, and it will be useful for the government to come out and elaborate why it agreed to such a provision. India has been at the forefront of seeking to utilize or even expand the flexibilities under the TRIPS agreement. And here we are in this FTA saying that, sorry, we don't think that flexibility is the preferable or the optimal route. So I'm really puzzled by this particular provision in the IPR chapter. Pooja.
Are there many such positions traditionally that India had been taking that have sort of been abandoned in this agreement?
This position on compulsory licensing is a good illustration. Similarly, India had been consistently opposing issues around labor, environment, gender in trade agreements. We've had a very strong resistance to discussing these issues at the WTO. In the India UK CETA, we have abandoned those long held positions. Of course, positions are never cast in stone, these are dynamic, but there must be some reason for abandoning those provisions. It will be useful if we could identify where we have gained through these chapters on labor, environment, and gender. I, for one, couldn't find many illustrations or any provisions where we could say that, well, this provision is crafted, this is negotiated for India's benefit. No, I couldn't find those. So, yes, we have abandoned some of our long held positions, particularly in the area of non trade issues, as well as on the compulsory licensing issue related to patents.
I suspect we might be doing this because we want to integrate more deeply into global supply chains, and this may be a condition for doing that. I wonder what China's position on some of these issues are. Does China have a position closer to India or closer to the developed world?
China's position, I would suspect, is closer to the Indian position. I would have a bit of different perspective. I am unable to see how abandoning compulsory licensing can help us integrate better in value chains. Similarly, how the provisions on labor and environment can facilitate our integration in global value chains. If we look at the provisions on environment, then in the IPEF, then those provisions are really crafted more around trying to exclude China from global value chains. So these provisions could become double edged weapons as well.
Sorry, I didn't understand that. What I was trying to say is that perhaps India's agreeing to some of these positions, abandoning traditional positions because we are offering to harmonize our rules of business with that of international corporations, large multinational corporations, and probably offering that as something which China does not offer in the whole China plus one narrative.
Pooja, there is really very little which we are offering through these chapters, which can help facilitate our integration in global value chains. That was my short point.
Okay, got it. So, on the whole, just to sum up, the tariffs, what has been done on the tariff side seems highly positive, but the sense that I get is from our conversation that those gains, potential gains from the tariff reduction, are in some way contingent on the rest of the chapters where a lot of effort from Indian business is required, where government may help, but there's only so much government can do.
Absolutely true. And if we have to take the complete perspective, then we also have to look at other issues such as government procurement and IPRs and non trade issues before we come to a conclusion of where this FTA will take the Indian economy. Maybe that's the conversation which is ideally held after a few years.
At the moment, it seems from our conversation that net India may not be gaining so much.
Let me fine tune that. Net, our exports will definitely increase, but the adverse impacts will curtail government's policy space to pursue catch up policies. And that adverse impact may not be immediately visible. that will become evident when there is a need to implement a particular policy, but because of what this FTA contains, the government is unable to do so. That may happen tomorrow, that may happen 2 years down the line. 2 years down the line, people may have forgotten that it's because of this FTA that government was not able to implement a particular policy.
Policies such as, for example?
Let's say giving boost to domestic manufacturers through government procurement. That's a standard policy tool used world over, including in developed countries, to give their domestic manufacturers assured orders which helps them scale up, which helps them reduce their costs.
Right. Although most trade negotiations and discussions around them, when we're talking about India, focus on agriculture, we haven't spoken much about agriculture. Before we wind up, do you want to say something on what this agreement has for agriculture?
Oh, yes. In agriculture, we have negotiated, I would say, pretty well. We have got tariff reductions on spices, for example, or marine products, which may strictly not be agriculture. But more importantly, we have managed to protect our domestic agriculture from tariff reductions. And when it comes to either the export interest or the interest of protecting farmers, I think the government has done an excellent job of protecting the farmers as well as creating opportunities for exports of agri products, including processed agri products.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Das.
Thank you, Pooja.
You've been listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Puja Mehra. Do stay connected with more of our coverage at the core. You can check out our website or sign up to our newsletter at www.thecore.in. That is www.thecore.in. Do also track us on LinkedIn, where we usually post synopses or extracts of our top stories and interviews. We would love your feedback, so do write to us at feedback@thecore.in. Thank you for listening.